Singapore, the Asian Gateway. Singapore is a true success story. The island country has come from humble beginnings and colonial rule to become one of the world's most prosperous nations. Much of the success of Singapore can be attributed to hard work, vision, and resourcefulness. However, the importance of Singapore's location cannot be underestimated, and this has played a crucial role in it becoming an economic power. Singapore has a GDP per capita of $65,000, putting it comfortably ahead of Japan, Canada, and Germany. The life expectancy of Singapore citizens is around 84 years, which is amongst the highest in the world, up there with Hong Kong and Japan. The future is bright. Singapore students are regularly ranked as the top performers in the world, with particular emphasis on math and science. So, how did this tiny island, with no real natural resources, achieve such well-being and affluence? To truly appreciate the rise and rise of Singapore, we have to go back to the 6th century. Traders from China and India frequently passed through Singapore without officially settling there. In the early 700s, Singapore became a trading post for the Srivijaya Empire, which was based in modern-day Sumatra, Indonesia. In the 13th century, Srivijaya's influence was overshadowed by the Muslim Empire of Malacca, which was situated on what is today's Malaysian peninsula. Malacca became a thriving centre of trade and activity, however, was overtaken by the Portuguese in 1511. The Muslim merchants relocated to the southern tip of the Malay Peninsula at Johor, across the water from Singapore. However, Singapore remained uncolonised and was home to a sparse number of Malay natives. In 1641, Holland overpowered the Portuguese and took control of Malacca. However, the Dutch remained largely uninterested in the island of Singapore. This all changed with the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain looked to gain some ascendancy in the Strait of Malacca. The Strait of Malacca is a narrow passage of water between Malaysia and Indonesia that links the Indian and Pacific Oceans. It was then, and is still very much today, a vitally important route for trade. The Dutch controlled this region from the port of Batavia, which is now Jakarta in Indonesia. In order to trade in the strait, the British had to pay exorbitant duties to the Dutch. They needed an alternative, and in 1819, they found one. Singapore. A British statesman, Stamford Raffles, realised the strategic and economic importance of Singapore and its natural harbour. Raffles wanted Britain to secure a treaty and establish a trading base. It would give them a vital foothold in the Strait of Malacca. At the time, Hussein Shah of Johor claimed to have control of the region that included southern Malaysia, eastern Indonesia, and Singapore. Raffles persuaded him to sign a treaty that would give Britain complete access to Singapore and its port for an annual fee. Shah agreed to the treaty, which was signed in 1819. The Dutch were fiercely opposed to the treaty as they saw the significance of a British outpost at Singapore. However, they were helpless to stop it. In 1824, the Anglo-Dutch Treaty was signed and signalled the end of any Dutch opposition to British presence in the region. The Dutch retained control of Sumatra and the upper Malaysian peninsula. Britain turned its attention to the immediate development of Singapore, or Singapura as it was known then, the Lion City. Singa and Pura coming from the Malay words for lion and city. From the outset, it was a success. When the British took over the island, it was mainly swampland and inhabited by Malay natives. Infrastructure was the first priority. Roads, bridges, hospitals and schools were soon built. Trading houses, warehouses and banks were established. Merchants began selling products ranging from gold, sugar, silks, coffee, weapons and wooden goods. The goal was to create a thriving trade hub, and Singapore was promoted as a free trade area with no duties or restrictions. This attracted traders and merchants from India, China and Malaysia, forming the multicultural makeup which forms Singapore's society today. Singapore set up specific districts for each nationality. such as the Chinatown district, which still exists today. A basic system of law was put in place, and the colony began to grow. In order to seriously expand, Singapore required workers, and lots of them. This demand was easily met, largely from China. The population exploded from just a few hundred Malayans in 1819 to over 30,000 just 20 years later. By 1856, over 500,000 ships had docked at Singapore, and the economy was growing. Singapore's location as a gateway to and from Asia was proving to be a massive advantage. In 1869, the Suez Canal opened, which shortened the shipping time between Europe and Asia considerably, as vessels no longer had to go via the African Cape. Singapore was the obvious stopping-off point for traders from Europe and Asia. In 1869, the total trade volume in Singapore was $39 million, and by 1870, it had rocketed to $70 million. By the early 20th century, Singapore's population had grown to over 250,000 people. Infrastructure, communications, and financial systems were all growing at a rapid rate. Although most banks were British-owned, China, Australia, France, and India also had banking interests set up in Singapore. When the Great Depression overshadowed the world economy in the early 1930s, Singapore was also affected. Things became even worse with the outbreak of World War II, when Japanese forces took over Singapore in 1942. This was the beginning of a harsh 3 years of oppression and economic ruin. Much of the infrastructure was destroyed, and Chinese, Malayan, and Indian citizens were executed, put into slavery, or simply left to suffer. When Japan finally surrendered in 1945, Singapore was in a bad way. Poverty, disease, and crime were rife, and the economy was virtually non-existent. However, Singapore was determined to flourish again, and soon became the hub for the global rubber trade. After World War II, there was a massive demand for rubber, which was sweet timing for the island colony. The Malay Peninsula was a rich source of rubber plantations, and Singapore was perfectly located to process rubber exports bound for Europe and the US. It quickly became renowned as a centre of financial, shipping, and law expertise, which allowed the economy to regenerate. In 1959, Singapore elected its first Prime Minister, Lee Kuan Yew. In 1963, a merger with Malaysia was established for economic benefits. However, political differences and social unrest in Malaysia meant it was short-lived. In 1965, Singapore became fully independent as a republic. And so began the economic miracle. Singapore decided that the best path for growth was through manufacturing and foreign investment. Tax incentives were installed to entice overseas investors, and the official language became English. A stable government was critical to attract investment, and a strict rule was imposed on the nation to eliminate any unrest or crime. Singapore initially focused on manufacturing textiles, and soon developed oil refining capabilities. This attracted major oil companies such as Shell and Esso, as Singapore was ideally located as the gateway to and from Asia. By the 1980s, Singapore had progressed from manufacturing textiles to electronics, and the service sector was booming, particularly in finance and insurance, all the while benefiting from lying on the Strait of Malacca. Although Malaysia and Indonesia also share the responsibility of ensuring the strait's security, it is Singapore that enjoys the economic benefits. Its port is the world's second busiest behind Shanghai. Around half of the world's oil shipments pass through the Strait of Malacca on their way to the huge Chinese and Japanese markets. Singapore's port alone accounts for 20% of global transshipping, which is the transfer of goods from one ship to another. Apart from finance and tourism, Singapore's other major industries include precision tools, oil refining, biomedical sciences, transport engineering, and medical technology. The days of rubber exports are a distant memory. Singapore's history and future can best be summed up by its famous merlion statue on the bay of the port. The mermaid represents the nation's origins as a fishing village, while the lion symbolizes courage, excellence, and strength. If ever a country symbolized these attributes, it is indeed Singapore.